Happy 100th birthday, FRE!
Whoa, that's even older than you, Caleb.
I'm only a few years older than you, Elena. Calm down.
Like Caleb said, I'm Elena Poulin, he is Caleb Stair, and this is FRE Lunch,
the official podcast of the Food and Resource Economics Department at the University of Florida.
This season is all about our greatest hits. Well, FRE's greatest hits.
It's part of a broad effort to showcase all the cool things FRE has done and is doing.
And with that, on with the episode.
Happy New Year, everyone! From New Year's resolutions to finding unique solutions, today's episode is all about behavioral economics.
That's right. This branch of economics is pretty cool because it relaxes some of those assumptions that may have a few people raising their eyebrows when discussing econ.
These are things like assuming that we always act in a rational way, choosing the healthier option or the more beneficial one or the cheapest.
You guys should hear how much of Caleb's salary he's spending on coffee every day.
Well, maybe this new year I will shift to energy drinks.
Many of us try to institute change in both ourselves and others.
The issue with trying to institute these changes is ensuring they stick.
Understanding why people do what they do in the first place is necessary if you're trying to craft effective, motivating change in 2026.
And it just so happens we have someone who works in this field right here with us. That expert is our special guest today, Dr. Bachir Kassas, Associate Professor in FRE and the founder of the Economic Experiments Lab.
My name is Bachir Kassas. I'm originally from Lebanon, and I have a bachelor's degree in economics from the American University of Beirut in Lebanon. I came to the U.S. in 2012 to Texas. I pursued a master's degree in economics, which I completed in 2014, and then I did my PhD in agricultural economics, which I graduated from in 2018. And that same year, I joined UF as a faculty member in the Food and Resource Economics Department.
Now, here in FRE, we like to think of ourselves as a hidden treasure.
While some people grow up around the field, for folks like Bachir, they may have more of a business view of econ.
I was one of those people that thought economics was, the financial market and banks and money. And actually, my master's degree was in financial economics. And then I learned about behavioral economics through volunteering for an experiment that was testing consumers' willingness to pay for different varieties or like attributes in tomatoes.
Luckily for us, Bachir had a friend who needed research subjects.
That's when I met her advisor, who later became my advisor, Dr. Marco Palma. He told me about behavioral economics over dinner that same night, and I started reading more about it. He told me first about non-academic books in behavioral economics, like Thinking Fast and Slow, and books like that I started reading up on, and I developed that interest that I wanted to pursue more of an academic knowledge in this field. And then I joined my PhD with him to work basically in behavioral economics.
Behavioral economics tries to explain the reason why we are not always rational. Like, why would you pay more money for a lower quality shirt because of the logo?
So the whole idea of this homo economicus who inhabits our economic models and maximizes utility, and that's how we get demand. And even on the producer side, how different producers make decisions, for example, from a neoclassical economics perspective, was not really accurately representative of real world behavior. And what was missing basically is the psychological element.
While at Texas A&M, Bachir worked for his advisor in his human behavior lab.
When I participated in that experiment that I told you about, and I got to meet Marco Palma, he told me about his lab, and he told me about his vision to build a neuroeconomics component in that lab, which is basically acquiring different sensors that would measure, different neurophysiological responses. And through that, we would hopefully gain, better data to be able to more fully understand the consumer and the individual decision-making process.
His experiences in that lab were the inspiration behind his Economic Experiment Lab here at the University of Florida.
That experience, I think, was pivotal in my ability to establish the Economic Experiment Lab. So the Economic Experiment Lab right now, it's still, mostly a mobile lab because I have a physical space for it, but it's not enough to, power all the stations that I have in the lab. So there's a physical component and there's a mobile component in that lab at the moment. In terms of equipment, we have 30 experimental stations and we have 3 neuroeconomic stations.
In his lab, Bachir has all kinds of gizmos to help with his work. Things like eye trackers or electroencephalograms to measure electrical brain activity, face expression analysis, software to measure emotional expressions, all kinds of stuff.
And the idea is we combine these neurophysiological data with behavioral responses to kind of understand the underpinnings of the human decision-making process, like what internal processes and mechanisms are at play to influence different decisions or how people react to different stimuli or nudges, for example. So that's in a nutshell, like what the lab is and what it stands for.
Tools Bachir and his colleagues are using allow us to address a common critique of survey use in econ experiments.
I will start with the challenge that was, pretty commonly cited and discussed in experimental economics, which is incentives for truthful reporting. So when we do experiments, usually to understand consumer behavior or economic decisions, the idea is if those decisions were hypothetical, then consumer subjects in those studies don't have really an incentive to truthfully report preferences, which might lead to inaccuracies in our estimates of different preferences and decisions that people make. And then enter monetary incentives, which were very heavily used in experimental economics, which is if you tie decisions to monetary outputs that people would get out of those studies. So you introduce consequentiality basically in those decisions.
These incentives are designed to improve the accuracy, but there is still no guarantee people will report their true preferences.
With neuroeconomics data, there is less of a chance of bias. That's because we are measuring the unconscious, involuntary, neurophysiological responses.
So the idea behind, neuroeconomics is number one, we can think of it as tapping into the black box of the human cognition and their, behavior and the decisions they make. But beyond that, I would say they allow us to measure internal processes that connect nicely with models that we develop to understand the underpinnings or like the mechanisms that result in a behavior developing. For example, if you present someone with an information treatment, let's say, or with like an arousal state, like mood, for example, emotional, inducement to induce them with a positive mood or negative mood, or even like a hunger state, for example. How does that influence the way that they approach food stimuli? We can really easily get that information in using the neurophysiological and basically the neuroeconomic tools. This is because they help us measure things like conscious attention and conscious attention, motivation, approach withdrawal behavior, internal conflicts. We can measure things like self-control, for example. We can look at the factors that drive food addiction or impulsive purchasing or many different, let's say unhealthy consumer behaviors that we hopefully try to, correct.
Now, if your New Year's resolution was to eat healthier, Bachir has a few studies that are just for you.
So we all know that hunger affects your food choices. When I'm starving, I'm not reaching for a salad. I'm going straight to the burger and fries.
Wait, aren't you a vegetarian?
Hunger makes us all do crazy things. Anyway, Bachir is trying to figure out why.
And the idea was maybe some of that effect is coming from impaired cognition, and some of it is from like a heightened motivation to, go for like a more rewarding kind of like food, for example. So we wanted to see it's not just hunger. That's like hunger is, of course, a very, strong and common state that people experience usually on a daily basis. But along with hunger, there comes like a different mindset that people get into that usually accompanies hunger, which is food anticipation. So once you get hungry, for example, you're waiting for your lunch break or you're waiting for like the recess in school, you're anticipating the meal that you're going to have. So how does that influence, number one, your cognition, and then number two, your food preferences, and number three, your food consumption behaviors?
To test this theory, Bachir used the tools in the EEL to measure how people responded to food cues when they were in a neutral state, hungry, and hungry plus anticipating food.
People in the group anticipating food had the highest attention and motivation towards the food shown. They also had the lowest evidence of cognitive thought.
They had the highest reactivity to food cues. They ended up eating less intermittent snacks, which might mean, that they're like saving space for like the anticipated meal. But in general, they end up, like preferring the meal more, both, in terms of how much they want to pay for it and how much they're drawn to like cues of that food.
Another issue, if you are trying to eat healthy, is, well, how do you know what foods are healthy in the first place? Yes, you can always check the nutritional label or the ingredient list, but for people like me, all those numbers and words are really confusing.
Caleb, you're an economist with a PhD, and you teach our writing courses.
Look, just because I can do it does not mean I want to do it.
Well, that's the whole idea behind this new label being proposed by the FDA. It's a simple sticker on the front of a package to let you know if it's healthier.
And we wanted to see, like what would be the implications of actually putting that label on, food products. What would that do to people's preferences and willingness to pay for the product? And we also wanted to see if there's, any benefit from incorporating also a tasty label, knowing, of course, that taste is one of the biggest motivations that, influences people's food choices.
For this study, Bachir and his colleagues tested how a healthy and or tasty label would impact consumers' willingness to pay for yogurt products.
What we noticed is if you just put the healthy label alone, it's going to reduce people's willingness to pay and their preferences for the product. But if you incorporate an explanation that, a product that carries this label, for example, is approved or is classified by the FDA as a healthy product in terms of having, for example, low sodium, sugar, and fat content, and there's specific conditions that food products must meet to qualify for the healthy label. But if you explain that information to consumers, this offsets that negative or downward push on that willingness to pay. So it offsets the whole decrease in willingness to pay from putting that label. So the implication here, or the insight that we could offer to the FDA, is if you want to, apply that label to food products, it has to come with some sort of an informational campaign to avoid, negative impacts on willingness to pay for the products that are choosing to use it.
So this episode is going to come out in January. And around that time, everybody's going to be making potentially a bunch of New Year's resolutions having to do with, let me try a new diet, let me get in better shape, that sort of thing. My question to you is, why do people do this? And more importantly, why don't they often stick to those New Year's resolutions?
Actually, I would probably frame self-control as the number one, factor that influences people's inability or ability to adopt a certain lifestyle or make a commitment, for example. Why do people make New Year's resolutions, right? From marketing, at least from my experience on the topic, we have, different selves that we can consider. One of them is the perfect, the ideal self, which is how people like to view themselves. They view the most ideal version of themselves, even if that version was not completely accurate. There's the true self, the real self, and then there's the ideal self. So people try to align, decisions and choices with the ideal self because it makes them feel better that they're getting closer to, to that, pedestal, let's say. But then, of course, when they make these decisions, the real self sometimes inhibits the ability to follow through with a decision once it's made, especially if that decision requires, effort. And usually when people make New Year's resolutions, it's, a decision that's more longer term. Right? It requires, effort that's expended on a daily basis or on a regular basis for, a certain, a long period of time, for example. If we're looking at this from the lens of the self-control, from the resource depletion, let's say, model of self-control, we can say that repeated expenditure of self-control on a daily basis without maintaining or managing self-control resources could lead someone to fatigue, at some point and regress or lapse in terms of, decisions they're making on their resolutions.
The dissonance between the ideal and true self is one of the main reasons that labs like this exist in the first place.
Understanding this dissonance and uncovering the full reality of our decision-making can be helpful to policymakers, business owners, and the general public in a wide variety of ways.
There's a lot of benefit to different players, basically. I would say to policymakers, to growers, producers, stakeholders more generally, and then to the, the general public or consumers. So from a policy perspective, one example is the FDA study, the study that we did about the FDA healthy label, that we can provide information, hopefully, to the FDA to help them, implement the label without influencing willingness to pay for products. There is also a study from the literature that looked at the new nutrition facts label, the new formatting. I think that was introduced probably in 2014, if I remember correctly, where I think an emphasis was put on increasing the font size for the calories and then splitting sugars into added and, natural sugars. So that study looked into how people or how consumers would pay attention to the old version of the label versus the new version, with, of course, like many useful insights that can be transmitted back to, policymakers in terms of, what are the potential effects of this new nutrition facts panel label format on consumers' attention to the different information? Is it actually, doing its job, its intended job of, inducing consumers, for example, to pay more attention to calories or to pay more attention to added sugars? So that could be like a benefit that you can afford to policymakers. From, benefits to stakeholders like producers, retailers, growers, you can provide benefits in terms of, for example, product packaging to see like if they have a specific label or information or slogan, where should they put it, what colors, even product placement and in grocery stores, like where should you put a product, what catches most attention. We have, for example, eye tracking glasses that people can wear and walk in the grocery store. We would be getting, eye tracking measures like visual attention, pupil dilation, and other metrics as they're doing, their shopping in the natural environment, which is a grocery store. So then you can provide information on, where in the aisle is the product going to be most noticed, for example. And some research has been done about this to say, for example, eye level is more noticeable, beginning or end of the aisle is more noticeable. So this also plays into, for example, retailers' decisions to price different locations across their shelves. There's a lot of other, applications in terms of promoting local or sustainable foods, or even having information treatments that would hopefully later inform information campaigns to support, let's say, the Fresh from Florida label, or like just local production or more sustainable production activities, let's say. So there's like a wide variety of, insights that could be provided to stakeholders. For the general public, a lot of it is, of course, like if you're working from a marketing perspective, the main benefit would be matching their needs and their desires and their wants with, product availability, and making sure that the attributes they care more about and that they, favor more are the ones that are being invested more in from a producer perspective. There's also, of course, a health benefit that, like you can provide them information that can benefit their health, whether that's, tips on how to better manage their self-control or how to avoid, unhealthy eating or improve their food choices or exercise or, any healthy behavior that you want, or like, for example, to refrain from impulsive purchasing. So any really like healthy behavior that you study could translate into useful insights.
And so we've reached pretty much the end of the episode, but we always like to ask our guests if the audience listening were to only remember one thing or one takeaway that you said today, what would you want it to be?
I would say behavior can be changed in positive ways. We just have to understand, the mechanics that drive the consumer decision-making process and even the individual decision-making process more generally. And it is such a complex mechanism that we have really useful and cool tools that we can apply to hopefully, gain a better understanding that could be useful for the general public.
So the moral of the story is that sometimes the best outcome requires something that alters our behavior.
Lots of things can lead to change. Meeting a random person in a lab like Bachir did.
Or a random coworker with a podcast idea.
A great podcast idea. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Anyway, if you like this episode and you're interested in learning more about Bachir's work, we will have a link in the episode's description.
You can even sign up to be a part of one of his many cool experiments.
And from all of us here at FRE Lunch, here is to a wonderful year. If you've made it this far, you've finished the entire episode, and we thank you for that. Tune in next time for more food for thought. Thanks again for joining us on this episode of FRE Lunch. We hope you'll come back again for seconds.